Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode in our look at Shivat Zion, Return to Zion. And what we're doing tonight is we're continuing our previous topic of the Netinim, right? The Netinim, who are this class of temple servants who exist, who come back from Babylon. They have foreign names. They're clearly descended because they temple servants are temple slaves, right? And they are clearly descended from temple servants slash slaves going back generations. And on the one hand, in in Ezra and Nehemiah, they are considered part of the returning Israelites, we can call them, or Judahites. So let's take a look again. Let's just remind ourselves where kind of how they are part of Israel, even though they are a separate class. And to remind you, why is it important to have them delineated? Because they are temple servants. Anyone who serves in the temple, it's important that we know who they are, how many there are, etc. And of course, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are very concerned with the matter of genealogy and who people are descended from. So let's take a quick look at some of the texts we looked at last time, including one I think additional text that we didn't see. Just to remind you, so in Ezra Zion and Ezra 7, there Ezra comes to Babylon, and he comes with an order from Artaxerxes, right? Where Artaxerxes himself says, "Here I'm pledging money, I'm pledging food for to support Ezra and for the temple." And he notes, and I'm skipping forward, so we're in Ezra Zion Chaf Daled, Ezra 7:24, who he's going to note that anyone who serves in the temple is not going to pay tax. You're not allowed to take tax from them. And among these people, right? Ulachomo dinti kokhanaya velevaye zamaraya taraya nitinaya ufalchi beit aladina minda velova halach la shalis lemir me'aleim. So we're letting you know you are not allowed to impose any kind of tax on any priest, any Kohen, any Levi, a Levite, a singer. If you remember, we talked about the singers, the Sharim, the gatekeepers. Here called Tara'aya because we're speaking Aramaic. And Nitinaya, the Netinim, right, who are the temple servants. So, in other words, they are, as people who serve in the temple, like the gatekeepers, like the singers, they don't get a tax. So it's clear that they are meant to be serving in the temple from the point of view of the book of Ezra. We similarly see that in Ezra, when it's talking about the whole community, it lists everyone and then it finishes up, Kol HaKahal Ke'echad Arbaribo Alpaim Shlosh Me'ot Shishim, all of the community as one. This is after he's named all these groups, including the descendants of the slaves of Solomon and the Netinim, right? They number 42,360. And what that means is it's the whole community. He's counting them all as part of the community. Remember, not counting their slaves and maidservants. Milvad avdehem v'amotehem. In other words, slaves, like here it's calling them male and female servants. They seem to be slaves. They are counted separately because they're not members of these classes. These are their servants. However, the Netinim are counted.
Why are not the
Let's take a
singers
look.
counted?
The singers are counted.
They also had 200 male and female singers.
These are additional singers. These apparently they also had additional servant singers. They aren't part of the classes of singers. They brought on like choir members, and it sounds like they're not counting them as part of the community. Also, let's take a look at some passages in Nehemiah. We looked at this before, where we're talking about the heads of the province. Ele Rashei HaMedina, Asher Yeshvu B'Yerushalayim, Uvarei Yehuda Yeshvu Ish B'Achuzato Barehem, Yisrael HaKohanim V'Aleviim V'Netinim Uvnei Avdei Shlomo. In other words, who are the heads of the province who live in Jerusalem and who live in the cities of Judah, who live each one in his own kind of estate, includes Israel, the regular people, the Kohanim, the priests, the Leviim, the Levites, and the Netinim, and the descendants of Solomon's slaves. In other words, they're all classes of people who are among, the heads of the province. They dwell along with everyone, right? So they seem to be counted together with everyone. Similarly, and actually not similarly, this is a passage. Now we're going to go to a passage that we didn't see before, just to give us, just kind of flesh things out. That in Nehemiah, when he's talking about rebuilding the walls, and he says who's in charge of every piece, he makes a note. Okay, and now I'm reading in Nehemiah Gimel Chaf Vav. That's Nehemiah 3:26. והנתינים היו יושבים באופל עד נגד שער המים המזרח למגדל היוצא. So the Netinim, the temple servers, they dwelled in the Ofel. So we all are familiar with the Ofel, the kind of the incline going up towards the temple, right? Opposite the water gate in the east, right? And the tower. And afterwards, it says they kind of as a landmark, as it were. He says, "Echazik Malchia ben Hatzorfi ad Beit HaNetinim v'Arochlim neged Shar HaMifkad v'ad Aliyat HaMidah." Malchia, who was a smith, possibly a tzoref, right? He rebuilt the walls up until where the Netinim and the merchants lived. In other words, they actually had a certain place they lived near the temple, and that's not surprising because they're supposed to be servants of the temple. So they are connected to the temple at this time when Jerusalem is in ruins and needs to be rebuilt. Okay, so we see that they do in fact serve in the temple. We talked last time, I'm not going to go back into the text because we discussed it last time, about how Yechezkel, at the end of the first temple period, said that in the future, there will be no Gentiles serving in the temple, bringing sacrifices in the temple. We said that possibly he's referring to people like the Netinim, right? And we contrasted it with a passage in Yeshayahu and Second Isaiah, which says that don't worry, non-Jew who has connected himself to God, you can serve in the temple, right? And that you will have a future that way. So we see these two contrasting visions. What we see in Ezra and Nehemiah is it's almost taken for granted. I wouldn't say almost. It's taken for granted that these Netinim have a job in the temple. Exactly what they're allowed to do or not allowed to do, we don't know. But clearly they're allowed to serve in the temple. And Danny and Libby ask, I see, are the Netinim mentioned in later Jewish history? Yes, that is what this class is about. So we are going to talk about that now. Let's dive in. Yes.
In the Second Temple, the Netinim have the same role they had in the First Temple, or it's a different
We
role?
don't know anything about their role in the First Temple. Okay, we're trying to kind of fill in the gaps. Okay, we have these Netinim that in the Return to Zion are described as returning from Babylon with the Judeans. We're going to see in the Mishnah, it talks about them that way as well, that they are a group who return together with everyone returning from Babylon. It's taken for granted that this is a group that was there and has come back. They in fact have foreign names. Okay, so is it like the Erev Rav coming from Egypt? Great question. Not quite, because they're given a role and a name, right? In other words, the Erev Rav in Egypt, there's this idea of it's just this group of Egyptians that just kind of joined, and who the heck knows what they are, where they are. Clearly people are marrying them, but they're causing problems. This group is a named group, right? They're named as servants essentially of the temple. They serve in the temple. We know that this is assumed when we're in the Return to Zion. How far back does this go? All right. So it seems like if they're being counted as returning and they're being counted essentially as a class of Jew, right? That's essentially the way they're being described in Nehemiah and Ezra. Now, it's not 100%. And remember, we looked at this verse last time, that the Netinim are among the Judeans who are told you cannot take foreign wives, right? In other words, they also have to divorce their foreign wives. In other words, they are part of the Jewish people and they cannot take foreign wives, right? That is the assumption. Now, particularly given how important genealogies are at this point where everyone's kind of saying, oh, I'm tracing my family back. It certainly seems likely that this was a group in the First Temple period. The idea that this was a group in the First Temple period is strengthened by the idea that Yechezkel speaks against The idea that in the future there will be non-Jews serving in the temple. So you're like, wow, it sounds like he's usually when you talk like that, you're speaking against something that exists, right? In the future, this won't be, but at present, this was, right? This has been. Remember, Ezekiel speaking right after the destruction, right? At this point. So he's talking about a situation that was in the temple.
Is it reasonable to think that these people back in the First Temple period had the status of ger?
All right. So this is the question: is what is the status of ger? And we're going to talk about that. We're going to go into the Mishnah, and this is the whole: what is the status of a ger? Okay. When were there gerim? When did you first have something where it was a convert? Were there a separate thing? This is a whole question. Why? Let's talk about it for just a moment. Okay. We have the idea biblically of a ger toshav. A ger toshav is someone who's dwelling in the land. He's not from your people, and you have to make sure that he gets justice. You have to not oppress him because he doesn't have family to stick up for him. You have to remember that you yourself were a stranger in Egypt, okay? And you need to take care of this person. What is this person? Is this person in any way part of the people? It seems kind of like not. It seems like this is simply someone from another nation who is living among you. However, for generations, if someone took a foreign wife, it seems like they would simply be assimilated into the Jewish people, right? Probably not the same if it were a man. Okay, it would be a different situation. All right. But it seems likely that in general, so for example, that's why the kings take foreign wives because, well, naturally, a king's going to take a foreign wife because they're going to want alliances, right? Shimshon, Samson, he messes around with Plishti women. His family is not thrilled. It is kind of a problem because they stay at Plishti women. We're seeing in the Shimshon story that it's not quite, you don't just marry an Israelite and become an Israelite. Like these are Plishti women. They're kind of still Plishtim. They're very connected to their families. They're very connected to their culture. It's not such a clear thing that that's what happens when you marry in. Okay. So it's a complex question. All right. So who's going to be a convert? How would you become a convert? Now, it seems like these servants of the temple they're essentially joining the Jewish people, but they're remaining a separate class. They seem to remain a separate class over generations. All right, so the question is, how would one join the Jewish people? It does seem like this servant class has, to a certain extent, joined the Jewish people, but on the other hand, they stay delineated, right? There's a delineated group of Netinim that stay distinct. So what does that mean? You could say, well, the Levites are also distinct. The Kohanim are also distinct. That's not a bad thing, right? So, but however, and these Netinim are supposed to serve in the temple, but they are distinct. And again, if we look at Yechezkel, if we say this is who he's talking about, then clearly he still considers them foreigners. Now, again, there's an idea in the Second Temple period, coming back to the idea of a convert, right? That there's a non-Jew, a foreigner who is nilveh el Hashem, who joins God. And this is the idea of the convert, right? So in other words, once we get to the Second Temple period, to the return to Zion, and then into the Second Temple period, it absolutely seems like there are people we would call converts. Okay, before we even get to like the forced conversions of the Idumeans and stuff like that, there are people who essentially want to join the Jewish people. They want to join in the worship of our God, and they join in some way. And the question is, okay, so what are they? What is their status? I saw that there was a comment, just a second, a comment from Moshe Matitya, who says, in the story of Shimshon, it seems to me that his parents regard his marriage to foreigners as shameful and scandalous. I think that's true. I think there's not a lot they can do about it. I think it's very clear they're not happy about it. And this I learned from Rav Mordechai Sabato. In the beginning, it says, and they didn't understand that it was from God. What does that mean? They didn't understand that it was from God, that he seemed to like these Plishti women, right? And the answer is because at the time, the Israelites were very, very weak. The Philistines were strong. And the only way to fight back were through these little petty things that you couldn't blame on other Israelites, right? In other words, Shimshon keeps on hitting the Philistines in these arguments he gets into because of women, right? He gets into something with women and then she betrays him and he goes, ah, and he goes, and he starts, and he kills a whole bunch of Philistines, right? Job one of an ass, he wasn't even armed, he just slaughters them, right? And they can't blame any other Israelite because they're like, that's Shimshon. You knew he has a thing for Philistine women. We can't do anything about this guy. So his parents didn't understand this is actually from God. This was a way to kind of fight back against the Philistines. But yes, they are. His parents are not happy. I think you are correct. They are not happy.
Did the Netivim come back as a group? Did any Netivim stay in Babel? Or do we know that?
Well,
Do we have any way
the
of knowing that?
So that there's no way of knowing that. There's no way of knowing that. And it would be the Netinim, like I would assume that I would assume like with every other group, like there was a thing there they say that Levites, not enough Levites came back, for example. Did enough Netinim come back? We don't know. One would assume that ones who really wanted to have a job in the temple came back, and ones who didn't stayed, right? And also you could say, okay, there are people who came back and said, we are Netinim. Could they have come back and just not said anything? Come back and just be with everyone else and not say, look at me, I'm a temple servant. Because the reason to say, look at me, I'm a member of this class at this point is to say I'm going to be serving in the temple. The singers are serving in the temple. Everyone here is serving in the temple in some way. If you don't want to serve in the temple, you just want to keep a low profile, would you have been able to just say, okay, you know what? Hey, you guys will remember me, and I'm not going to be serving in the temple. I'm not sure. Again, they have names that are pretty distinct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do we know anything about whether Netinim were allowed to marry other Jews?
Okay, so let's jump into the next section because that's what we're talking about now. So when do we next hear about Netinim? Well, we do have mention of them. Let's not go in chronological order. Let's look at the Mishnah and the Gemara, and then we're going to come back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, let's look at the Mishnah. Okay, so here we see in front of us a Mishna Kiddushin, right? Dalid Aleph, it's 4:1. And it says, Asara yuchasin alumi Babel. By the way, we have a very similar passage in the Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem Talmud. Asara yuchasin alum. Oh, actually, I shouldn't say that. We're not at Jerusalem Talmud yet. Right now, we're reading the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, Asara yuchasin alumi Babel. Kanei Leviye Yisraeli Chalalei Gerei V'Charurei Mamzerei Nitinei Shtukei Vasufei. Okay, there are 10 groups of lineage that came up from Babylon. Kohanim, priests, Kahanei, priests, Leviye. Of course, we're reading in it's priests, Levites, Israel, who are people who aren't priests or Levites, right? Chalalei, we know Chalalim are people who have been disqualified from Kohanim because of an illicit marriage, right? Chalalim are people who have been disqualified from being a priest because of an illicit marriage. Gerei, right? Converts. V'charurei, people who have been freed slaves. Mamzerei, bastards. And if you remember that in Jewish law, bastards are not the product of people who aren't married to each other. They're the product of an illicit marriage, right? So if a young man marries his aunt or has relations with his aunt and she gets pregnant, that child is going to be considered a mamzer, a halachic bastard. Nitine, the Netinim, right? Shtukei, the children we don't know where they're from. Vasufei, foundlings. Kanei Leviyev Yisraelei muterim lavoza bezeh. Priests, Levites, and Israelites can marry each other. Leviye Yisraelei Chalalei Gerei V'Charurei muterim lavoza bezeh. Levites, Israel, Chalalim, people who are not allowed to be priests, converts, and freed slaves can marry each other. In other words, the only people that a freed slave can marry is a member of the Kohen class. Gerei v'charurei mamzerei unitinei shtukei vasufei kulam u'trib. Here we have our netinim. Who can a netin marry? He can marry a convert. I'm reversing it a little so we understand what it means for our netinim, right? They can marry a convert, a freed slave, a bastard, Note that a bastard couldn't marry any of the previous people. A bastard, a person that you don't know where he's from, and a foundling. None of these could have married the previous class. I shouldn't say none. Converts and freed slaves could have married the upper classes. All these others can only marry each other, right? I'm going to flip to the English. You're going to see the English here, okay? With regard to converts and emancipated slaves, Mamzerim and Gibeonites, children of unknown paternity, and foundlings, it is permitted for all of the men and women in these categories to marry one another. All right. So if you are a Netin, they're translating Netins as Gibeonites because it's already using the explanation, the rabbinic explanation of who these guys are. Right. We just said we don't know where they are, where they're from. They are temple servants of foreign origin. We're going to hear, according rabbinically, where these guys are supposed to be from. So let's dive into the Gemara. So here I am looking at Yivamot Ayin Chet Bet. Okay. This is actually a Gemara based on a different Mishnah, the Mishnah in Yivamot, where the Mishnah simply says, Mamzerin unitinin asurin v'isuran isur olam. Okay. You can't marry a mamzer or a natin forever, for generations. Echad scharim v'echad nakevot. The same is for males and for females. This is being much stricter than our other Mishnah. Our other Mishnah seem to say that, well, there are people who can marry. There are enough groups that can marry these people. But in this Mishnah, we're not talking about the other groups at all. Those other groups kind of don't exist. You were talking to a regular Jew, essentially. It says you're not allowed to marry someone who is a mamzer, someone who is the result of an illicit marriage. Not a halal is the result of an illicit marriage for a priest. So a halal is not a mamzer. A mamzer is the result of an illicit marriage for anyone from Israel. It's, and something, it's essentially usually an incestuous marriage, but it could also be from an affair. So you can't marry them, and you can't marry a natin, right? And this is true for males and for females. And now we're going to find out where the Netinim are from. Okay, we have just been calling them Netinim. They are temple servants who have been given over to the temple. Amar Rav Chana bar Ada Netinim David Gazar Alehem. Why can you not marry a Natin? What's the problem? David Gazar Alehem Shneimar Vayikra HaMelech LaGivonim Vayomer Alehem VaGivonim Lo B'nei Yisrael Hema V'Gomer. King David decreed on them because he was talking about the Gibeonim, the Gibeonites. And he said the Gibeonim are not of the children of Israel. So in other words, David declared this. My Tama Gazar Alaihu, why did he make this decree? Essentially, there was a famine for 3 years, and David was trying to figure out why. He asked the Urim V'Tumim, and he finds out that it's because of the Gibeonim, right? That Shaul killed Gibeonim. That's the plain meaning. But what the Gemara is saying is it's giving two meanings. It's that David is being punished. One, for Shaul, that he didn't eulogize him properly, and two, because he killed Gibeonim. And where was that? That was in Nov. The idea is that Nov, which was a city of priests, would give Gibeonim food, and so when he killed them, they all died. So he tries to appease the Gibeonim, they wouldn't be appeased, etc., etc., etc. Let's go through the Gemara. I'll do it, I guess, in English to be quicker. So this is the story straight from the book of Samuel, straight from Shmuel, that when the Gibeonim say, you need to kill the sons of Shaul. So he says to the Gibeonim, okay, look, could we make peace about this? And the Gibeonim were like, no, you need to kill the sons of Shaul. We want seven sons killed and hanged for what Shaul did to us. And David says in the Gemara, in the Talmud, part is not in the story in Shmuel. David says, you know what? There are 3 things that are special about Jews. Harachmanim v'baishanim v'gomle chasadim. They are merciful, they are kind of ashamed of themselves, and they do acts of kindness. Now I'm skipping ahead. Anyone who has these three signs should join. It's appropriate for them to join this nation. In other words, anyone who has these three signs can join. Someone who is merciful and kind of not proud and does kindness. If they're not like that, they shouldn't join. And these Gibeonim are horrible, right? Because they won't have mercy, and they are demanding the sons of Shaul be killed. Okay, and then in fact, David does give the sons to be killed. Okay, right? What is that when people go by and see these princes who are being hanged because they messed with fake converts, because the Gibeonim are fake converts. Why are the Gibeonim fake converts? Because they lied to Yoshua so that he would keep them alive, as we're going to see. We're going to go back biblically to see that story. Because of that, this is a nation that we should join. And when they saw this, a whole group, immediately 150,000 converts joined the Jewish people, right? Who is it talking about? It's actually talking about Avdei Shlomo, Shlomo's servants. So it's connecting it back to our original story, saying, where did these servants of Solomon come from? Well, when they saw what David was willing to do for the Gibeonim, all of these people converted and became servants. So now let's go into the original story of Gibeonim, and we'll see why essentially you kind of need to connect the Netinim to the Gibeonim in order to understand why these aren't normal converts. Okay, because a normal convert, you should be able to marry, first of all, in their first generation, and certainly once they're a descendant of a convert, why should you not be able to marry someone of this class? So for the Mishnah to say you can't marry a Natin, only a bastard or of these other classes that can't marry anyone else can marry a Natin, they have to connect it to someone who can never be a convert, all right? If you have a tradition that this is the rule, why? It doesn't make any sense once you have converts. So let's take a look. We're going to look at this passage in Joshua and Yehoshua. We're reading that from Yehoshua Tet, Joshua 9. Of course, Joshua, his job is to conquer the land. And the rule is that the 7 nations in the land essentially get exterminated, right? There is a war on any nation in the land. So what happens? Gibeon hears about his battles in Jericho and in the Ai. And what they do is they come in disguise. They make it look like they've come from a far distance. They put worn out bags on their donkeys. They use worn out water skins. They put on old shoes, old clothes, and they take old bread with them. And then they go to Yoshua where they're camping in Gilgal, and they say, we come from a distant land and we want to make a treaty with you. So they say, but maybe you dwell in this land, and I can't sign a treaty with you because, again, we have to war with everyone who's in this land so that we can dwell here. Vayomer el Yoshua avadecha anachnu. Vayomer leim Yoshua mi atem u'me'ayin tavo. They said, no, we're your servants. He says, who are you and where are you from? Vayomer elav me'eretz rechoka ma'od ba'u avadecha. L'shem Hashem Elokecha ki shamanu sham'o bet kol asher asa b'Mitzrayim. He said, we come from a very distant land because we heard about everything your God did in Egypt. And we heard what he did to the Amori. We heard what he did to Sichon and to Og. Okay. And so our elders told us, go for a far trip and sign a treaty with these guys. We took this bread hot from the oven, and now look at it, right? Like, look at this. It's all dry now, and it's all rotten. No, come on. You can see that we've come from a far distance. And these wineskins were new, and now they're cracked. You can see we came from very far because we're all, you would think, okay, they're protesting a little bit too much, but Yoshua is apparently a little bit naive. Vayaz lahem Yoshua shalom, ve'echod lahem brit lachayotam, ve'shavu lahem nisiyei ha'ida. So he signs a treaty that they're going to live. And also, the heads of the community, of the Israelite community, also gave their oath. ויהי מקצה שלושת ימים אחרי אשר כתוב להם ברית, ושמעו כי קרובים הם אליו, ובקרבו הם יושבים. So after 3 days, they realize, oh wait, they live right here. So they go on the third day, they go out to their cities, and they're like, hey, but they don't attack them because they signed a treaty. You can't go against a treaty. They swore to God they're not gonna attack them. And they said, we can't do anything to them, but because we swore an oath. And they said, what are they going to do? All right. So he said, so what are they going to do? They're going to live, but they're going to be this lower class of they're going to cut wood and they're going to draw water. Now, the cutting wood, drawing water, the idea of that is always that it's the lowest job that no one wants. So when someone says what they will do is they will be the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, that's going to suck, but they're not slaves. They're free people who are going to be the lowest class there is. Okay. Yoshua said, why did you lie to us? And they're like, because we were afraid. We're afraid for our lives. So do whatever is right. And that's what he does. He makes them hewers of wood and drawers of water. And that's what they can be. And then the declaration is that, okay, so they can't marry in because they are false converts, right? They essentially tricked us. And because of that, they like parallel to Ammon and Moab, their descendants also cannot convert. Okay, so we see in Bamidbar Rabbah a story similar to the Gemara that we read, right? And again, Netinim asurim lavo b'kahal. In Bamidbar Rabbah, it actually brings the Gemara, and it says, and it tells the story again of David and the Gibeonim, which is later on, right? Now I want to clarify something. So what the Gemara sets up is a 2-stage thing. We have the Gibeonim living among us. Why? Because they tricked Yoshua. They tricked Joshua. And so they are living among us as a lower class. Why can't they convert? Because they were so cruel and they made David kill the sons of Shaul. And because of that, he said, clearly they don't have what's in them to be converts because they are not merciful. Because they're cruel, not merciful, they can't convert. Okay? And so we see here in the Bamidbar Rabbah, this is the Midrash, right? It says, V'zo shaman David v'richakan shelo yavo b'kahal. David stood and pushed them away that they should not be part of the community, the kahal. V'zo hi shishaninu shenetinim asurim lavo b'kahal. And that's how we learned that Netinim are not allowed to join the community, right? And it connects that to the story. So here we have this idea of connecting the Gibeonim back to the Netinim, and this is the reason that they cannot be part of the community. So how far does this go back? Because what we saw when we were looking at Ezra and Nehemiah is, okay, they're a class, they are living with the Judeans. They seem to have kept somewhat separate because they're still like Netinim, but are there rules, right? What we were talking about more before was, can they enter the temple, right? Now let's take a look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and see what the Dead Sea Scrolls does. Now, Dead Sea Scrolls, we're going backwards, okay? We're trying to fill in the gap now that we have between the return to Zion and the Mishnah, which is about 200 CE, right? Well, I shouldn't say that. It's compiled in 200 CE, okay? So let's see what, yes.
Yeah. Yes, I have a feeling that the word Netinim in the Mishnah does not mean the same as the word Netinim in the Ezra Nehemiah. Is that possible?
Was connecting it to Ezra and Nehemiah. In other words, whatever it means, it's connecting it to the same Netinim that were in Ezra and Nehemiah. Here, I'll show you the Yerusha, because it's saying these are the groups that came from Babylon. In other words, it's connecting it back to that verse in Ezra. So you could say, yeah.
In Israel, it feels like important people have a job in the temple, and like in the Mishnah, it looks like people who are, these conquerors, half conquerors, whatever they are. Doesn't seem similar.
Okay. It is similar because just because you have a role in the temple doesn't mean that you're a hotshot. We're used to thinking of it. So if you are Yechezkel, then yes, a job in the temple means you're a hotshot, and that's why he doesn't want these guys having a job in the temple. Does it have to mean you're a hotshot? If you're a temple slave, are you a hotshot? I wouldn't say so, right? So are you looking at them as temple servants? They are servants of the temple. Now, what's interesting is, as soon as, now I agree with something you said, Ido, that from a point of view of the Mishnah, as soon as you say they're Givonim, what do you mean they're servants of the temple? The Givonim are supposed to be cutters of wood and drawers of water. Are they doing it for the temple? Okay, but they're not entering the temple to do a service of the temple, right? They don't have the same job. However, from the point of view of the Mishnah, it's the same group. In other words, the Mishnah is saying these are the same Netinim as in Ezra and Nehemiah, okay? So I hope that answered it. So like they're treating them differently. They're not seeing them the same way as we saw them in Ezra and Nehemiah, but they are identifying them as the same group with the same name. Now let's take a look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to look at 4Q Florilegium. Okay, so we're going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at two Pesharim. A Pesher, okay? A Pesher is a type of interpretation that is unique to the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they take a verse of usually a biblical prophecy, but not necessarily. They can take it from Psalms, etc. They take the verse and they say, this verse is actually talking about what happened to us last year, or what's going to happen in the end time. And they interpret it sometimes a little allegorically in order to talk about what it's really doing is it's hinting to something that happened to us or will happen to us. Okay? Now, 4Q Florilegium is interesting. We call it Florilegium. Obviously, they did not call it Florilegium. Florilegium means that it's a collection of excerpts. That's a Florilegium. A collection of excerpts, sometimes thematically structured. Florilegium, it's from like collecting flowers, right? So 4Q Florilegium is a pesher that is not of a one continuous text. It's verses taken from different places and a pesher on that. So let's jump into 4Q Florilegium where it talks about the Netinim. Here we go. You should see 4Q Florilegium on your screen. It's quoting a verse first in 2 Samuel, Shmuel Bet, and then it's quoting a verse in Exodus, Shmot, right? And it says, Ulimina yom asher tziviti, as it's written in the book, hu abayit asher lo yavo shema, okay? This is the house, it's talking about the future temple, right? Asher lo yavo, that no one will come there ad olam forever. V'amoni u'moavi u'mamzer u'venechar v'ger ad olam ki gdoshe shem. Okay, that all of these groups, all of the mamzer and the ben nechar and the ger, all of them are not going to be able to enter the mikdash. What is it? So Joseph Baumgarten, when he was first looking at this, was saying that this can't be talking about the temple, because what is there about converts not being able to go into the temple? And he said, so the ben nechar, which he connected to also the natin, right? Because we've seen elsewhere that the foreigner is called, the natin is called a foreigner, and the v'lo right, and it says livnot lo mikdash adam, to build for God a temple of man. So Joseph Baumgarten says they're talking not about the temple, they're talking about the community, that these people can't enter the community. So just as elsewhere we saw that the natin can't enter the community, here also, right, the natin cannot enter the community, right? And that's the ben nechar that's not entering the community. Now, later on, when the Temple Scroll came out and people looked at it, the Temple Scroll has something about how a ger and a person who's nilveh el Hashem, the person who's joined, can't come into the temple. So he changed his mind. He's like, no, actually, I think maybe it is talking about the temple. And it's not talking about joining the community. But the question is this a bridge from what we saw in Yechezkel and Ezekiel, that they can't come into the temple, to not being able to be part of the community? right? This idea of the Mikdash Adam, a sanctuary of people, a temple of people being the community, and so they cannot join.
I'm sorry, Mary. I didn't, who is it that changed their mind here?
Oh, sorry. A researcher named Joseph Baumgarten, he's very well known because I want to give him credit, right? So when he looked at this, and because I was looking for stuff on the Netinim, right? So he has an article about the Netinim where he points to this passage and says, here we see similarly to in the Mishnah where the Netinim are not allowed to be in the community, here in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're not allowed to join the community. Okay, because it seems like it's not talking about the temple because it says converts also can't be there. So why would a convert not be able to go into the temple? So he says it must be because it's saying Vayomer livnot lo mikdash adam, and God means for us to build him. Here it says a man-made sanctuary, but I agree with Joseph Baumgarten that generally it means a sanctuary of people. Mikdash adam, a temple of people. A temple of people. In other words, our community is like a temple, right? And so we can't let these people into our community, right? But in the temple scroll, it actually says that converts can't be in the temple, should not be going into the temple. Let's talk about the next temple, right? So he says, oh, wait, it could be talking about an actual temple and simply saying all these groups are not allowed to be in the temple. I think maybe we could look at this as a bridge from what we saw in Yechezkel, not necessarily in Ezra and Nehemiah, right? But a bridge between the attitude that these people should not be serving in the temple to these people should not be, can't join, fully be part of the community. Why do I say that? Because again, if we look at Yeshayahu, if we remember from our last class, second Isaiah, right? Yeshayahu is saying, don't worry, you can serve in the temple. Why is he saying that? Because no one is saying anything else? If we had just Ezra, Nehemiah, and Yeshayahu, we would say there's no one who says these guys can't serve in the temple. But it sounds like there were people saying that they can't serve in the temple. And once there is no temple, how does that translate, right? Or even when there is a temple, there's a connection between Mikdash Adam, right? The temple of people, right? The community and the temple. Once you see your community as kind of a temple, then you can start saying, oh, wait, if I had a problem with you serving the temple, I have a problem with you joining the community. Now, could that problem with joining the community have gone way back? Yes, right? Because we don't know what the rule was in Ezra and Nehemiah for the Netinim in terms of marrying other people. We know they're not allowed to marry foreigners. Are they only supposed to marry each other? Right? Because they've still got foreign names, but maybe they're just keeping those as family names. Are they supposed to serve in the temple but not marry other groups? We don't know. We don't know. So let's take a look. For example, the whole attitude also, we also have to remember the whole attitude of Dead Sea Scrolls towards converts can be harsh. Now we do have, they do mention, I'll show you another Pesher actually that deals with converts. Let me actually get it up on my screen. So what we're seeing here is Pesher Nahum, right? So this is a continuous Pesher on the book of Nahum. And I am going to be looking at fragments 3 to 4, column 2. Yes, here we are. And here we see that they are including the Gerim, the converts, with everyone else. Okay, so Pishrot's meaning is Amat Ephraim asher betalmud shikram ulshon kozbehem usvat mirma yitu rabim. The meaning of this verse, it's merov zunei zonao. It's talking about kind of the. I'll read the English. Because of the multitude of the whoredoms of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcrafts that sells nations through her whoredom and families through her witchcrafts. This is where Nahum is talking about Assyria. Assyria as a prostitute / witch, okay? And it's saying, what's the actual meaning? On those people from Ephraim, in other words, the Prushim, the Pharisees, who are leading, or no, but rather not, people who are leading Ephraim astray, people who are leading the regular people astray, who have false teaching and lying tongues, and a language of deceit, And with that, they are going to mislead many. Who are they misleading? Melachim sarim kohanim ve'am im ger nilva arim u'mishpachot yovedu batzatam. Kings, princes, or officers, nobles, priests, and the regular people, together with the ger nilve, I think it's a convert. It's a stranger who has joined. So there's a recognition that there are converts. There are people who have joined. And yet in the verse that we read before, these people are not allowed in this community, right? At least in terms of Florilegium, in terms of that specific passage from the Dead Sea sect, does not allow these people in. Okay, so we see this kind of tension that we already have even in the beginning of the Second Temple period. Even though what we would see, just if we just look at Ezra and Nehemiah, we don't see a tension in terms of these different groups being part of the community. Remember that they're counted as literally part of the kahal, part of the community. But later on, and possibly under the surface also, there's this tension of, but can they serve in the temple? But can they be a full part of the community? And that tension continues on until essentially they disappear as distinction. The same way we don't have Ammonites and Moabites anymore, we don't have Netinim anymore. Okay, what happened to the Netinim? My assumption is some of them may have left, but I would imagine that a lot of them did simply assimilate into the Jewish people. One way or the other, they ended up being part of the larger Jewish people to the extent that, again, we no longer have this distinction. Of course, I'm happy to be proved wrong if someone can find evidence of any group of Netinim, but also there's a possibility that they simply got fed up and left, right? That would not, I think, surprise any of us.
Miriam?
Yes.
Okay, we don't often get into halachic issues in this class. If I understand you correctly, well, first, I think it's pretty clear that the Chumash takes a very, very hard line on who's in and who's out. But it seems that question is very, very complicated, going all the way back well into the First Temple period.
Oh, yeah, I want to assume. Look, I think it was as complicated as you wanted it to be. I think there absolutely were people where, they marry, someone came in from, from some foreign thing and they married them and that was it. And they were part of the, they're part of the people. And I want to remind you that Nehemiah's big issue, there are different issues. Ezra's like, if we marry foreign women, God's going to kick us out again because God doesn't want this, right? And Nehemiah has a further, it's not that he doesn't agree with that, but he's also like, the kids can only speak Ashdodi. They can't even speak our language. What is this? This isn't them joining us, right? They're not joining us, right? So there's that aspect of it as well. Now, when in the First Temple period, that seems to be something that people are concerned with less. I won't say that certainly in Israel, and I imagine in Judea as well, Israelites kind of started doing foreign practices all the time, but I think there was an assumption, especially if you took a woman. So, for example, in the Torah, right, we have Eshet Yifat Torah, right, a pretty woman, and you see her in war, and you bring her home, right? And there isn't we halakhically we're like, okay, she converts, right? In the text, what does she do? Well, you cut her hair, she grows her nails, she mourns her family. And my interpretation is, in other words, you have to recognize she is a human being. You can't just take this woman and expect her to be like, oh, yay, here's my conqueror. You have taken a woman from her family. You are bringing her to a different place. You must let her mourn. She is a person. And you must let her mourn her family. After you let her mourn her family, right, for the full amount of time that she can mourn, then you could see, okay, you still want her. If you don't want her, you can't just get rid of her just like that. You can't force her because she's a human, because she's a person. However, the assumption is that if you do if you take her in and you stay married to her, she is now a part of the people, right? She's not, no one's going to be like, okay, her children don't count, right? So again, Yitzchak had to marry someone from the family, and Yaakov had to marry someone from the family. But once we get to Yehuda, Yehuda marries a Canaanite woman. That's who he marries, Bathsheba the Canaanite, you know? And it doesn't seem to be a problem. Once you're a group, because at that point they're a tribe. There are 12 sons. Then once you're a group, you can afford to take in someone and say, okay, this is our culture, this is us, right? Now that changes in a way. I mean, at a certain point, we need kind of rules, right? It's not clear in the first temple how it worked, right? It's not clear in the first temple how it worked. And also it's not clear like how much it would have been happening. In other words, one assumes people stuck pretty much to their own, right? Once you're in Babylon, well, now you're out. Once you're in exile, you're out among the peoples. How do you even stay Judean, right? How do you stay this nation? And then you're coming back, and you're a small group that's coming back. Okay, there are Israelites who stayed, but you're a small group coming back, and there are all sorts of foreigners all around you, right? And if you marry them and they are in their culture, Ashdod is right there, right? Ashdod's not far away. It's not hard to speak Ashdodi, right? It's not hard to keep up your Ashdodi culture. So then the question becomes, okay, how are we going to handle this, right? Now, that's part of it. And part of it is look at the Torah, right? So Ezra's like, look at the Torah. You're not allowed to do this. We're not allowed to marry these women. They're not allowed, they're not allowed to marry our women. And then there's also the question of culture. And then the question is, okay, so is there a way to join, right? And it seems like, at least when we look at the Netinim, there is a way to join even early on. And again, if we look at Yeshayahu, it looks like there is a way to join, at least early on. And the question is, but is that a full joining the way that we're used to with converts later on, right? Like even forced converts like the Edomians, right? Okay, you made them convert, they converted, and then their children what are they, right? Are they, and then the question is, well, but it was forced, so does that count? But the thing is that in general, the way it works is that a convert's child is not even, they're not a convert anymore, right? They're Jewish. So the question is, why isn't that not working for the Netinim? So the only way for this not to work for the Netinim is if we go back, we say, well, they are descended from a special case, right? And they're descended from a special case, which is the Gibeonim, and there's a special thing that happened that shows that they can't join the Jewish people because they're so horrible, or they're so cruel, I should say. And that's the reason. And it seems to be explaining a tradition that the Netinim can't marry whoever they want to. In other words, they can't be like all the other children, converts. Like, why not? And you need a reason for that. So we see that there's this kind of mixed message for these groups that gets ironed out to a certain extent in the way converts in the convert process, right? Once we have a process, this is how you convert, then there's a clear path to fully joining the Jewish people, right? As opposed to when you have these kind of groups that joined in this kind of unusual way, and then it seems like they still have this unusual status, which causes all sorts of problems, right? So in other words, the path to today's conversion is actually a nicer path than what we usually recognize, because it's a pathway to fully joining without kind of doubts 2 generations down.
Is the fact that they were mentioned in the Gemara an indication that they were actually around, or is it just a
No, because the Gemara is explaining the Mishnah. So we don't know that they're around in the Gemara, because the Gemara has to deal with the Mishnah. So the Gemara is dealing with the Mishnah. Who are these Netinim? On the contrary, to me, the fact that the Gemara is saying, okay, there's this whole story about the Gibeonim, and this is why, it's easier for them to draw a line that, they are for sure the Gibeonim, because the Gibeonim are, because the Gibeonim don't seem to serve in the temple, right? And that is the defining trait of the Netinim, right? But once we get to the Gemara, it's almost certainly that they're not around. It doesn't seem like the Netinim are around anymore, because it puts a spotlight on the fact that once we're in the Talmud, they are almost certainly not a group of people that actually exist anymore within the Jewish people.
And would they have been around in the time of the Mishnah?
Well,
Second Temple.
so that it certainly seems like in the beginning of the Second Temple. The question is how
Right.
far down, how
Yeah.
far into the Second Temple. I think that there is an indication that they do because they're in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah could be mentioning a group just in order to explain it because they're looking at the verse in Ezra, but they're adding on categories. They're not mentioning every single category. To me, that indicates that there is a group called the Netinim, or that they want to identify as the Netinim in the Mishnah.
Miriam,
Yes.
you have an apparent contradiction. I know Chazal tried to get around it, but just in Sefer Dvarim itself, in Parshat Va'etchanan, it says it in no uncertain terms: "You shall not give your daughter to his son, and you shall not give your son to his daughter."
Yeah.
Whereas later on in the book, even though, as you mentioned, there's the issue of a woman that you take in war, which seems to be a
Well,
total.
that's not a big contradiction because it's a special case. So the easy answer is this is a special case where you're allowed to take this woman in war. This is a special case where you're allowed to take her. But not just that. We have accounts of battles in the Torah where the thing is you kill all the men and you can keep the women. It's not fun to read, right? But we have it over and over, right? If you want to even be less fun, it's you kill every mashtin bakir, right? Anyone who pees on a wall is dead, and the women you take, right? So it's not an unusual thing, and it's not quite the same as the context. If you're dwelling among these nations and you're marrying their women and they're marrying you're intermarrying, you're going to start idol worship. You're not allowed to do that. Whereas if you're at war with them and all the men are gone and you're just taking the women, it's very clear that the women are going to assimilate to you. They're going to be part of your group. Now, I would say that's not the best way to have a happy home life. But, so see everyone next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me.